They tried to make it disappear so completely that, for years, it felt less like a missing episode and more like a rumor people whispered about. Not canceled in the usual sense, not loudly condemned or publicly debated, just quietly erased. No reruns, no home releases, no acknowledgement. It was as if someone had decided that letting it exist at all was too much of a risk. And yet, the story behind that decision only made the episode more fascinating, because when something gets buried that deeply, it usually means it touched a nerve nobody wanted to admit was there. At the time, the show itself was already walking a tightrope. It thrived on discomfort, on saying the things other sitcoms carefully avoided. While most television families solved their problems with heartfelt speeches and soft music, this one leaned into dysfunction, bitterness, and blunt honesty. It wasn't trying to be inspirational. It was trying to be real in a way that felt almost aggressive. That tone attracted millions of viewers. But it also attracted scrutiny. Every joke, every storyline, every line that crossed into risky territory had to survive a constant battle between creators who wanted to push further and executives who were always calculating how far was too far. For a while, that balance held. The show built its identity on being outrageous, but still somehow acceptable enough to stay on the air. It mocked social norms, poked at sensitive topics, and never pretended to offer moral lessons. Audiences laughed because it felt rebellious. Critics complained because it felt irresponsible. But that tension was exactly what kept it alive. It existed right on the edge of what television would allow, constantly testing boundaries without quite breaking them. Until one episode finally did, on paper. It didn't look like the moment everything would collapse. It followed a familiar setup. A married couple trying to escape the monotony of their daily life, chasing a brief moment of excitement that predictably spirals into disaster. That kind of storyline was nothing new for the show. It had built entire seasons on similar premises. The humor came from how badly things went wrong and how unapologetically the characters reacted to it. But this time, the situation they stumbled into wasn't just embarrassing. It carried implications that felt uncomfortably close to real life. The couple checks into a rundown motel, hoping for something different, something that might break their routine. Instead, they unknowingly become part of something far more invasive. Hidden cameras record their most private moments without their consent. When they eventually discover what happened, the story shifts from awkward comedy into something more complicated. There's still humor, still exaggerated reactions, still the same biting tone. But underneath it all is a premise that feels heavier than anything the show had tackled before. That's where the trouble began, because the idea of being secretly recorded wasn't just a punchline. It hinted at something deeply unsettling. It raised questions about privacy, about control, about what happens when personal boundaries are violated and turned into entertainment. Even though the episode treated it with the same irreverent humor the show was known for, the core concept refused to stay light. It lingered. It made people uneasy in a way that couldn't be laughed off so easily. Executives noticed that immediately. Television at the time operated under a very different kind of pressure. Networks depended heavily on advertisers, and advertisers were extremely sensitive to controversy. It wasn't just about whether viewers would watch. It was about whether sponsors would want their products associated with what they were watching. And this episode, with its mix of intimacy, exploitation, and legal chaos, started to look less like edgy comedy and more like a potential problem. Concerns started to pile up. Would audiences misunderstand the message? Would it spark backlash? Would it attract the kind of attention that could damage the network's reputation? These weren't abstract worries. They were very real risks in an era when public outrage could quickly escalate into organized campaigns. And that kind of backlash was already building. Around that same period, criticism of the show had reached a boiling point. Some viewers saw it as a harmless comedy, but others viewed it as a symbol of everything wrong with modern television. Complaints grew louder, letters were sent, and certain groups began pressuring advertisers to distance themselves. The show became a lightning rod in a much larger cultural argument about what should and shouldn't be allowed on TV. So when this particular episode came up for review, it didn't exist in isolation. It landed right in the middle of that storm. What might have been dismissed under different circumstances suddenly felt like a liability. The storyline wasn't just provocative. It was risky in a way that overlapped with real-world fears. The idea of being recorded without consent wasn't purely fictional. It hinted at legal and ethical issues that networks weren't prepared to navigate in a comedic format. And unlike other controversial moments that could be edited or toned down, this episode's entire premise revolved around that central idea. You couldn't simply cut a few lines or trim a scene. To make it safe, you would have to fundamentally change the story. And by that point, it was already finished. So instead of trying to fix it, they chose a simpler solution. They pulled it. No big announcement. No official explanation. It just disappeared from the schedule. Viewers never saw it. It wasn't included in reruns. It didn't appear in early home releases. It became something that technically existed but was treated as if it didn't, for the people who worked on it. The decision felt strange. From their perspective, it was just another episode. Maybe a little sharper, maybe a little more daring, but still consistent with the show's identity. They had filmed it the same way, performed it the same way, laughed at it the same way. Nothing about the production process suggested it would be singled out like this.
That disconnect made the situation even more surreal. Years passed, and the episode took on a life of its own, not on screen, but in conversation. Fans started hearing about a lost installment that had never aired. Some believed it had been destroyed. Others thought it had been shown only in certain countries. Stories spread, details shifted, and the truth became harder to pin down. But the reality was simpler and stranger at the same time. The episode was still there, complete, untouched, just deliberately kept out of circulation. And the longer it stayed hidden, the more significant it seemed. Because by the time people started seriously asking about it again, the world had changed. Television had changed. The boundaries that once felt dangerous had moved. Topics that were once considered too sensitive for comedy were now being explored openly across all kinds of media. When the episode finally resurfaced years later, it didn't cause the kind of shock executives had feared. Instead, it sparked curiosity. Viewers who had heard about it for so long finally had a chance to see what all the fuss was about. And what they found was something interesting, not because it was more extreme than modern content, but because it revealed how different the limits used to be. What once felt unacceptable now felt almost tame. But that doesn't mean it lost its impact. If anything, the passage of time made its themes more relevant. The idea of privacy being invaded, of personal moments being captured and shared without consent, became far more common in the years that followed. Technology made it easier. The internet made it widespread. Situations that once seemed exaggerated started appearing in real headlines. Suddenly, the episode didn't feel like it was pushing boundaries for the sake of shock. It felt like it had accidentally tapped into something that would become a much bigger issue later on. That's part of what makes its story so compelling. It wasn't just a case of censorship over crude humor. It was a case of a network encountering a topic it didn't know how to handle at a time when the cultural conversation around that topic hadn't fully developed yet. The safest option from their perspective was to avoid it entirely. But avoiding it didn't erase it. It just delayed the moment when people would have to confront it. Now, looking back, the episode stands as more than just a curiosity or a piece of lost media. It's a snapshot of a moment when television hit a boundary it wasn't ready to cross. It shows how fear, of backlash, of controversy, of uncertainty, can shape what audiences are allowed to see. And it raises a question that still matters today. Not just why it was banned, but whether it should have been in the first place. Because sometimes the things that get buried aren't the ones that go too far, they're the ones that get a little too close to something real.